we were all enthusiastic advocates of what are sometimes called static maps, paper maps. And we learned that paper maps accommodate time in surprisingly versatile ways. So there was a kind of meta message to this volume to push back on gently on digital mapping and GIS mapping, and remind people that, if anything, the rise of these new technologies should allow us and encourage us to go back to earlier maps with new eyes. A third point, diversity persists all the way through the global early modern and indeed into the modern period, even though there are some convergences in what I sometimes call the Esperanto of map signs. Nonetheless, especially with the rise of counter mapping in the last 20, 30 years, local plurality, local diversity of mapping cultures is being celebrated and resurrected. The last couple points are all maps tell time. So we ended up broadening our ambit beyond maps that were intentionally historical to include all kinds of ways that maps tell time, and that putting a map into an archive changes the way it tells time. That turned out to be very interesting too. And just a final point that I would add, it's not something we elaborate in the introduction, but something that we discovered and that will come out today, is that maps took part in a wider kind of proliferation of diagrams and visual images in the early modern period and beyond. And they need to be studied, I think, in that context. So we were very happy to have participants in our midst, particularly Veronica Deladora and Dan Rosenberg, who really encouraged us to push the envelope and look beyond what we might consider traditional maps. So today what we will do is to examine 4 different emergent themes of this collection, sampling maps from various chapters. I think we'll hit more than half, although not all of them by any means. And we will begin with diagramming time.
Great. Oh, was that the handoff, Kären?
That's the handoff. Go for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm the co-author, and I'm going to handle this first part of our sample platter on diagramming time. We're going to look at 3 different diagrams, and they're not specifically maps, these 3 images I'm going to show you, because they don't show an actual place on Earth, but they do use space in order to show certain aspects of time. So the first thing you're seeing here, what looks like a Greek temple, is in fact the American educator Emma Willard's The Temple of Time from 1846. Those of you from the East Coast may know the name of Emma Willard. She was a very famous educator of young women at a time in the 19th century when that radical idea became normalized. And what she really wanted to do was to create powerful images for a democracy, to educate the citizens, that included women, in how to understand not only the national history, which was by then over 70 years old, but also the history of the world. So this is what her Temple of Time is doing. And as you can see, there's just tons of data coming toward you, flowing directly toward the viewer. The columns show various famous people, such as Frederick the Great and Andrew Jackson. The roof shows a series, the ceiling shows a series of categories of people, like theologians. This is still, of course, the era in history where the theologians would be smack in the middle of everything, warriors on the right. And then at the bottom, you can't really see in this image because it's too small, but there's a whole bunch of kind of trends of various nations' histories flowing toward you. Now, interestingly, for the moment in history when the bottom dropped out of the geological time spectrum, which I'm going to show you in a second, Emma Willard begins the history of the world with the creation, which is the back wall. I love this. And it's in 4004 BC, which is when the Irish theologian Archbishop Usher, through a careful reading of the Bible, had deduced that it was. So this is a wonderful kind of play on something that Emma Willard thought very powerfully about. She said, maps use space to show you space, but I'm going to use space to show you time. And that is just a really insightful observation from our friend Emma Willard. All right, So that's in the book. We can move on to another diagram of time. This is a very modern one. This was made by the United States Geological Survey just over a decade ago. And this is showing the history of the planet Earth from its earliest beginnings around 4.5 billion years ago. That's at the very, very bottom left-hand corner of the image. That's the baby Earth emerging from the gases of the solar system. And then, I just love this, using the form of a geological specimen, which is an ammonite shell, this wonderful curling snail-like shape is used to show the unfolding of the billions of years of geological time. And it culminates, as the pink arrow shows you with this close-up, in, I have to tell you this because I'm from a beach in Southern California, it culminates in a surfer dude. So if you ever wonder what is the place of California in the history of the world, I tell you, it is the culmination of world history. But this bears closer inspection, and you guys can be Googling this as I talk to you, but you can see various standout features of geological time being presented to our attention. And we're simultaneously everywhere on Earth, and we are also simultaneously nowhere on Earth. It is designed to show you the kind of top 10 geological episodes while also skirting controversy. So for example, if you look at the 65 million year mark, which is around, I don't know if you have an aero capacity, Kären, with this. It's over on the kind of the right-hand side. Yeah, there you go. That's the 65 million year mark. That is approximately the moment of the Great Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, what you might know as the asteroid event, when the dinosaurs were largely wiped out by what is thought to be an asteroid. All of that is left out of this geological time spiral, so that you are bringing in people to the idea of deep time, but you are not excluding anybody from the idea of deep time. So this is a wonderful kind of public service announcement from the United States Geological Survey. Okay, next. This is our final image from this first section. The American psychologist William James invented the term the stream of consciousness in 1890. It is a term and a metaphor that we continue to use today, usually unthinkingly. But this diagram that he made in 1890 brings us back to the moment of its original conceptualization. It is the first diagram that we have of an attempt to show the human mind thinking. William James studied geology with the Swiss-American geologist Louis Agassiz, and they floated down the Amazon River together. And so William James was introduced to the idea that the earth has a history, but also your mind has a history. And here he's trying to diagram the sentence, "The pack of cards is on the table." And that is the time that is being shown on the bottom axis of this diagram. And it takes about 4 seconds to say that sentence. I timed it this morning with my phone. So if you say it kind of slowly, the pack of cards is on the table. So that's what those little marks show you. So you might be asking yourself, well, what are those bumps showing? So what William James is trying to show is the content of your mind at any one moment as you are thinking this sentence over 4 seconds. And so he says that those, what look like mountains, are the fullness of your thought. So that when you launch into this sentence and you've just said you don't have much of a fullness of thought because you've just said the. But by the time you're at the end of the sentence and you've said the pack of cards is on the table, your mind is really, really full. I have to say it's a very boring concept, the pack of cards is on the table, but your mind is full of this thought. So, and then this is where it gets weird because he's a kind of a geologist. Those lines are a knife cutting through your mind at any moment when it is thinking this thought. And what he wants to show there is the stream of consciousness, that no matter where the knife cuts through your mind, it is catching you in this full, unbreakable stream of your thought. So that in contrast to the locomotive, the train, which has been invented in the 19th century and which breaks everything up, your mind is the opposite of a locomotive. It's this beautiful, organic, unbreakable stream of consciousness. So this is a wonderful way of trying to diagram the concept of time in something that is not inherently spatial, which is your thinking, but which William James here makes spatial. Okay, back to Kären.
That's lovely. So all three of the images that Carolyn has just talked about are not conventional traditional maps, but they're attempts to use map-like symbolism to capture the flow of time itself. Now we move to movement through space, which is one of the major historical themes of historical mapping, as I'm sure you're aware. And we go right back to Emma Willard. This is a map made 20 years before her now famous, iconic Temple of Time. And this particular image is actually also very important. It is the first map that appears in what was the first national atlas, historical atlas of the United States. Intriguingly, however, this map of indigenous migration, which is the first image, is set aside from the proper flow of historical time, which begins with the arrival of Columbus in the New World. So for Emma Willard, who identified with the colonists in the process of the subjugation of indigenous people and expansion of European culture on the North American continent, indigenous migrations was a preamble, and she made it simply part of the preface to her National Historical Atlas. Nonetheless, she included it, and it's worth looking a little bit at what she's doing in this map. In a very impressionistic way, she's covering some of the major movements of a few of the major known tribes, and I should say there's an emphasis here on communities, indigenous communities that would have been known to the colonists in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast because of who they had interacted with. Showing affiliations by color. So this is one of the things we find her doing very well, using the graphic palette at her disposal, and showing them as unbounded entities that move fluidly over space, probably over a period of centuries. There's no timeline attached to this. It's a very, as I said, impressionistic, very kind of expansive, fluid notion of indigenous movement. And there's a reason for that. If you identify with the European colonists, as Emma Willard did, it's very convenient, and it was a long-term strategy of colonial justification to believe that indigenous people didn't really have bounded territories, as they're shown here, not having bounded territories. So the Europeans not only bring the beginning of real history to North America, but they also bring the beginnings of bounded space as we now understand it. And so even though this is a preamble meant to represent migrations before the time of Europeans, those of you who are looking closely at the map will have already noticed that the dashed lines that underlie it they point toward the state boundaries that will be emerging in the 18th and into the 19th century in those areas. So here we have a colonist's look at migration of indigenous people. This sets up a very interesting contrast with an indigenous map of indigenous migration. This is one that was discussed by Barbara Mundy, the art historian, who specializes in Aztec history and Aztec iconography. And I think I'll jump directly. This is a difficult to read image because the original is hundreds of years old. This is the oldest image, I think, in the book. It dates from around 1600. But what we can also look at to get a clearer sense of what it's portraying is a facsimile that was created in the 19th century. And if you look at the overall structure of this image, it the way to read it as an Aztec reader is to start in the upper right-hand quadrant and follow this little line that snakes through the whole image, down around to the lower right-hand quadrant, and then up to the upper left. And the final scene of this historical drama takes place in the lower left-hand quadrant, where I'm sure you can see all the figures look upside down to us. What happened, what the overall trajectory that's being traced here is the movement of the Aztecs into the Valley of Mexico, where they conquered the indigenous inhabitants of the valley and established Tenochtitlan, which would become the site of Mexico City after the Spanish got there. And it's just very riveting, I think, to realize that when they enter the Valley of Mexico, the drama is so important that you have to turn the map upside down and begin to read it from a different angle. What's difficult to see at this magnification, but if you peer closely, you might be able to see, is that all along that brown line that snakes through the image are very small, precisely drawn black footprints. And they alternate left, right. They each have a complete ball and heel and 5 toes. They're really beautifully done. And what that image indicates is the direction as well as the territory covered by this migration. The Aztec elders grouped up there in the upper right, they begin their move around, and each time you see what looks like a green blob with some kind of plant growing out of it, those are hill signs in Aztec cartographic iconography. And the plants or animals that are sprouting out or sitting on the top of them represent the name of the place. And the number of dots next to each of them represents how many days the ancestors spent in that place. So there's actually quite a bit of precision, even metrical precision about time built into this map, even though it goes from quite a mythical origin into the much more recent past, the setting of temporal and political boundaries in that region. One other feature of this that I would draw your attention to that I think is a very sharp contrast with Emma Willard's map is there is violence explicitly put onto this map. When the Aztecs come in and slay their enemies, you get to see dead bodies, you see cut off heads, you see blood dripping from corpses. They were not shy at all about indeed celebrating the bloodshed that was involved in the conquest of the Aztec territory, what became the Aztec territory. And that is quite a contrast with the kind of historical maps that Emma Willard would create. If you were to page forward through that historical atlas of which we saw the first image, the later ones simply describe a very gradual, benign process of expansion, purchase, territorial acquisition without a lot of mention of gunfire at all. And one of the things that we were delighted to discover at the Rumsey Room is that David Rumsey has collected an early national atlas of Mexico in which this particular facsimile is featured. And this, we all agreed, was a striking contrast in the deployment of indigenous history within a national story to what we saw in the United States. Because here, the newly minted Mexican patriots could have anchored their national past to the coming of the Spanish colonists to South America, but that was an inconvenient thing to do since they had just fought a revolutionary war against them. They much preferred to anchor their past directly in this glorious Aztec image. And the fact that the Aztec capital site was exactly the site of their capital too made this all the more resonant. So we see a different kind of staging and framing, and all these columns of prose around this image are detailed, loving analysis to allow modern Mexicans in the 19th century to be able to read that image. So there you go. Migration is certainly one of the big themes that has been addressed in maps of the past, but change over time in ways other than human movement across space also is a huge theme. And one of the things that we learned from William Rankin, again, as I mentioned, he was a map designer before he became a map analyst, was that most of the maps that we study and produce essentially employ what he calls the photocinematic mode of representing time. That is to say, The map maker is effectively sitting behind a camera and deciding how long to let the shutter stay open. In this image, which I think is a good place to start for this section, and it's drawn from Bill Rankin's chapter, the cartographer has said, and the cartographer here is working for the famous French historian Paul Vidal de la Blache, let's leave that shutter open for about 3,000 years, shall we? So what this map does is present place names, just place names, not arrows, not movement, but place names and important archaeological sites that any educated French reader in the 19th century would have immediately recognized as important sites in the history of ancient Egypt, all the way up to Alexandria. And if you peer in closely, you can see the Valley of the Kings, you can see Thebes, you can see the sites of the major pyramids. And if you've read about this and if you participated in the romance of archaeology, which was a big deal in the late 19th century, your own imagination would allow the drama to bloom into a map like this, even though it's missing the kinds of dramatic iconography that we are accustomed to seeing now in our both online and paper national and global historical atlases. That's a historical map. And I think it makes an interesting juxtaposition to set next to it a map that uses a similar technique, but it covers less than 1% of the land area. This is maybe 100 square miles as opposed to 300,000, and certainly less than 1% of the time span, because this cartographer from Japan was interested in documenting a disaster, a natural disaster that occurred within the span of 3 weeks. And if I just take a couple minutes to narrate it, you will all be able to read this map. Right about in the center, and I guess I can move my cursor up in here, is where a natural dam was created across a tributary to the Sai River in the downhill plain below a mountain that suffered a massive mud flow and avalanche from an earthquake that occurred in the summer of 1847. That natural dam caused water to block up behind the dam, up here in the area that's colored dark blue, and to begin to flood agricultural villages that were naturally positioned cheek by jowl there all along the river. And each little white oval that you can see, most of them in that region are colored now blue. Those are all villages that were flooded as the water accumulated behind this natural dam. Well, what happens after 3 weeks of that? So much water pressure had built up that the dam burst. And then all these villages downstream, many, many more, over 100 villages, flooded as well when this massive pent up stream of water came into a wide open and very vulnerable indeed, marshy kind of plain along in the province of Shinano, what is now Nagano. So we're up in the Japanese Alps. As you know, Japan is a highly active tectonic landscape. These kinds of disasters were very common, actually, especially in this region. They were hit by them repeatedly. And this is a one-page newsprint. Basically, it's a one-shot attempt by a publisher to share a dramatic visual of, but also a lot of information about what had happened up there, which villages got flooded, when the water broke, and so on. So this is actually a event mapping is the way I think of it. It's not long-term history, but a short-term event that nonetheless was captured very effectively in map form. And from there, we're going to turn to another river map. It happens that we had 3 river maps in this section on change over time. And this one uses a very different mode of representation. I think Carolyn's going to take that one for us.
All right, yeah, this is Harold Fisk's beautiful, beautiful map of the Mississippi River made right at the very tail end of World War II for the Army Corps of Engineers. And it uses airplane photography to map the course of the Mississippi River over the last 2,000 years. There's about, don't shoot the messenger here, but there's about 30 equivalent versions of this for the whole course of the Mississippi River. So this is just a bit of a much, much larger project. What's so lovely about this map is, first of all, that it's lovely. It's just objectively a beautiful, almost artistic representation that reminds us that mid-century abstraction in painting has a lot of debts to the rise of aerial photography. But it's also a beautiful meditation on how geological time overlaps with human memory. So each color of these sinuous bands represents a 100-year snapshot of time. The deepest red that you see kind of squirting out like an intestine on the lower right is the oldest. So that's right about the time. Yeah, thank you. We have a close up here. You can see the geological time column on the left and this squirting intestine that I have on the right. That's the oldest stratum of the Mississippi that is revealed. And if you look at these other sort of, moments of the Mississippi River, they're partially blocking and erasing some of these older strata in very much the way that new memories have a tendency to wipe out older memories. So I just love that about this map, is that it like so many inspiring cognitive tools, it helps us to think outside of its boundaries into other areas rather than turning in interpretively on itself. The final thing I would say about this map, and Kären, can you go back to the previous image on this, is that the least interesting part of Harold Fisk's map is the current Mississippi River itself, which is that ghost-like snake that courses through the middle of the map. And, there's so many different ways that one could read and interpret that. It testifies, of course, to a geologist's view of the world, which is the modern road is uninteresting, but the road cut, now we're talking, we're going to stop the car and get out and look at all the strata. Harold Fisk is doing the same thing, while also drawing our attention to the fact that the map would not have been made if it weren't for the fact that the modern Mississippi River was as beautiful as it was dangerous to the modern people who lived around it. That on the one hand, it was essential to their livelihood, but at a moment's notice, or even at no notice at all, it could wipe out hundreds and hundreds of human lives, not to mention the crops and livestock on which they depend. So this was a project of enormous economic utility, but also they found time to make it beautiful. Okay, so that's it on the Mississippi. Oh yeah, we're going to close out this section before we head into what I think is our final section with William Rankin's wonderful map called Peak Slavery, 1790 to 1860. Bill Rankin is a cartographer and historian at Yale. He's one of the contributors to this volume. He made this, like, it's not just a picture in the book. He actually made this map. And what he's trying to capture here is something that is often forgotten, at least by the students that I teach at Stanford, which is that slavery in the United States is not just a snapshot. It's not just one moment that we often think of. We often think, when we think of American slavery, as Alabama cotton fields circa 1840. But what this captures is slavery as a flow-like phenomenon. So the color green that you see on the top right-hand side up there in New England captures the year 1790, whereas the hot pink color, which you see most represented down in the deep South, captures the year 1860. The size of the bubble captures the number of slaves, and you can see how over time between 1790 and 1860, the very eve of the Civil War, peak slavery changes within the United States. The peak of slavery, the highest density slave population, moves from essentially the Mason-Dixon line, or the kind of lower upper Virginia, New Jersey area, down into what is going to be called the Cotton Kingdom of the antebellum period. So this is a really, really interesting attempt by a modern cartographer to capture flow-like phenomena using a variety of visual visual tools such as color and bubble size. Okay, time travel. If you show me the next one, oh, okay, so that's a signal to me. Okay, this is, but okay, let me tell you what we mean by time travel. Time travel is the how we are thinking about the attempts by modern people to go into the past by moving through some space in the present. So a car, for example, or a train. There's a historian who once asked the question that I love, and he said, "What time is this place?" And I think of that every time I go to some, park, state park, or something that is trying to teach us about the past. We have decided that certain places within the United States are evocative of a certain time in our national past. So that's what this map is doing, and it's what the next one is going to do. So this one is a road map that was published at around the 200-year anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which happened from 1804 to 1806, as was one of my students wonderfully put it. It was a federally funded whitewater rafting expedition. It was launched by Thomas Jefferson, and as many of you know, Lewis and Clark took 50 men and went all the way to the Pacific and back, losing only one man, and that was to appendicitis, not to any other cause of death. It was a glorious moment for the new nation. And they published immediately afterward a series of maps. That's not what this is. What this is it's a modern map trying to show you how you can use the modern interstate highway system to bring yourself back to the moment of Lewis and Clark. And so along the way, they've pulled out various places on the map that they then try to excite you with excerpts from the diaries of Lewis and Clark. So I've pulled out here for you one of Lewis's entries about meeting a series of Native Americans and thinking through that encounter. There's so much that can be said about this. The simultaneous presence and erasure of Native Americans is just one of them. But if this makes you want to Google the Nicholas Biddle map of 1814, which is the first map of the Lewis and Clark expedition to be published, do not let me stop you, because that is a beautiful, beautiful map. It is held at the David Rumsey Map Center, and you can zoom in on it as much as you want, and you can compare it with this. Okay, we have another one right after it, which is the driving tour of the 1862 Antietam campaign. So what time is this place? The time is 1862 in September, the moment of the one-day Antietam campaign. Don't shoot the messenger, but this morning Wikipedia said that 22,000 men fell at Antietam. So it still stands as the deadliest day in American history. But if that fact is wrong, please don't blame me. I just checked Wikipedia. So this is an interesting driving tour because it takes about a day to do. So in a weird way, you're kind of traveling along at the same pace that the battlefield would have taken. I'm getting a little interference from somebody's microphone. Okay, I will keep going. So we've pulled out here for you one of the things that they try to show, which is sort of things that are interesting that you can stop along the way with your phone and read more about. This painting that you see here is entirely constructed for this map. That is not a historical timepiece there. It is created for modern purposes. So this is from the essay by William Ackerman in the volume about mapping battlefields in American history.
Okay, and then the last two maps we wanted to show you in this section about time travel are from East Asia. And here we're looking at the landscape of China as a whole, the historical core of China. That's, you can kind of see the seacoast there wrapping all the way around the southern and eastern sides of it. That's a little bit of Korea off to the northeast. So this is really a map of a huge territory to which Japanese, at the time this map was published in Japan, had no physical access. So unlike the pilgrims who Jim Ackerman wrote about, the Japanese consumers and connoisseurs of this map had only their imaginations as a vehicle for travel. But travel they did in great numbers. And this is actually one of the most beautiful of a great raft of maps produced in the 19th century in Japan. You can see the beautiful Prussian blue that has come in. And the skillful designer of this map is Hokusai, one of the most famous of all Japanese printmakers. I'm sure you've all seen his image of the Great Wave, which also uses this beautiful Prussian blue, which was a very new, vivid, and splashy color in the Japanese palette. And what he has done is to kind of create imagined topography. It almost looks like a seascape, but these are not waves, these are mountains drawn pictorially from this oblique or bird's eye view perspective, which he used a lot. He experimented with landscapes of Japanese cities done similarly from an imaginary position up in space, where you would be able to have the whole panorama of this beautiful and culturally saturated landscape spreading out below you. I do like to compare this at one level, although I think it's artistically much more evocative, to the Paul Vidal-Lablache illustration of ancient Egypt, because like that, this was designed as a kind of reference tool for very literate readers for whom the place names carried the perfume of romance. And I've just singled out for a close-up one of the most dramatic, kind of heightened peaks on this whole image. This is a mountain that had at its base or on its height both Taoist monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, hiking trails. It was the site of poetry. It was probably the most saturated place in the whole already saturated map. But you can see place names in little rectangles scattered all through this. This was a large, like almost a meter by a meter, of luxurious publication and much coveted by the literati in Japan, who were indeed fascinated with the romance of faraway places that they were not allowed to visit. And just a few years later, we get an image like this. And this is the last one we'll show you today. Done within a generation, but what a different world and what a different kind of view. The same oblique or bird's eye view perspective is put to a very different use here by another extremely talented floating world print maker and designer artist, Sadahide, who in this case has decided that it is imperative for his countrymen to record and study the development of landscapes in what he has experienced in his own lifetime as a period of dramatic and rushing, convulsive change. So there's it seems to me that this is a fitting slide with which to end for a couple of reasons. It brings in a very modern looking metrical precision. There's a sharp focus in contrast to the much more impressionistic kind of palette and technique of the previous image. This is an attempt to record exactly where the streets are, how they intersect, where the factories are, where the ships are and from what countries, what flags are they flying, how many of them were in the harbor and so on. It's almost like a snapshot. And that was very deliberate because, and here's my final point, this was created as a kind of time capsule. Utagawa Sadahide knew that he was living through a period when the landscapes that had just appeared before his eyes, in this case, the port of Yokohama, which didn't even exist 10 years earlier and now had become the hub of international contact in Japan, these brand new landscapes were surely going to themselves give way to newer landscapes and be overbuilt and lost to the past. And so he rather urgently urged his readers and viewers to go out and record what was happening in the landscape and save it so that people like us today in 2021 could look at images like this and understand where we've come from and the nature of the past that we all share. So I think I have one more slide, and I just wanted to share this. We both wanted to share this. I've put this discount code, in case you're interested in the book, into the chat so that you can easily copy and paste that into your email or into the web. This code, Time and Maps 30, was offered to us by our editor at the University of Chicago Press. And it brings the price of the book from about $45 to $30. This is not just a book sale pitch, but I thought I'd add it as, if nothing else, a love note to our very generous and skillful professional editors who we worked with at the University of Chicago Press. We really are in their debt for turning our work of scholarship into a coffee table quality book. The production values are very high. The color is true. And we're very, very pleased with the book. So we're very happy to take questions, should any of you have questions. And at this point, I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, one, I'd like to thank you so much to start your presentation. One, the maps are very interesting and very beautiful. And I think your enthusiasm for the topic is really something else. It really comes across in your presentation. So thank you for that. And with that, we would like to, let me look at the chat here to see if we've got any comments here. No questions, but if any of the participants want to have a moment to ask questions or converse, why don't you go ahead and either raise your hand or ask them, unmute yourself and ask the questions.
Well, I'd like to just give a huge thanks to the both of you for it's an incredible presentation. The book, it looks like it'll be on, I'm an artist and I'm always influenced by maps. So know that the range of your appeal and your information goes way beyond. But I really want to thank the Map Society for making this available to people, without cost. And it really makes me want to rejoin the society, even though I live far away.
Well,
so
that being said, we would
yes.
encourage all people that are joining today who are not members to check out our website, and please consider joining us. We do our best to have interesting and informative meetings, and I think you'll also find that, particularly with the pandemic, the map societies there's a lot of cross sharing, and we've made a lot of connections and friends in other societies. So please join us if you're so inclined.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. When I was reading or studying maps or writing about them for a university project, I mostly centered sort of on Mapamundi, and your book is much wider and more expansive than that, and that absolutely no objection from me in that regard. But I'm sort of curious if anyone touches on, or if there's any discussion of how a lot of Mapamundi, there was this, it sort of started with the beginning of the creation with the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve there, and then by the time you got out to the edges of the map, you would be in the future essentially, because it would be the day of judgment, and it would be everyone would be coming to be judged at the end of the world. And I was sort of reminded of that a little bit with some of the maps, even though none of them went into the future. They were all observations what previously happened, but it was like there was a mapping of belief and mythology as well as time in itself.
Yes.
Kären, go ahead and take that. I'm going to try to find the Rosenberg map for another one of the questions. So you work on that.
What you might not know, Kate, is that there is a Buddhist tradition of Mapamundi that is
I have heard of that.
Christian ones, that they're just fascinating here.
I have heard about it. I have not had a chance to read or find out much about it, but I have heard about it.
We actually have the David Rumsey collection includes a beautiful Japanese printed version that was adapted from a very old Chinese Buddhist Mapamundi, but it is very similar. They have these kind of navels of the world at the heart of the scene of the birth of Christ in the case of, right, Jerusalem in the, or Bethlehem in the case of the Christian maps, and it's India in the case of the Buddhist maps. And then they kind of open out across both space and time. There are some fascinating studies of both of those kinds of maps. Yes, we were, for the purposes of this particular collection, we kind of had enough to cover with the early forwards.
That absolutely makes sense. I in no way wanted to suggest or imply that that sort of mapping of belief or like the entirety of the existence of the world was specifically a Mappa Mundi, a Christian thing. I knew there were other traditions of that, but I was curious if there was any discussion of that kind of any kind from any cultural tradition. But yeah,
I could also add that it's interesting to think about strategies of embedding time in maps or using maps to express time when it comes to a cosmological map like those medieval Mappa Mundi, because the entirety of the world from creation all the way to today is there, kind of like with Carolyn's time spiral from the USGS.
yeah.
Actually, that is a cosmological map too, isn't it? That's exactly what that is. And one has to play a little bit fast and loose with space if one is going to incorporate all of time. But anyway, yes.
Oh yeah, some of those Mappa Mundi maps are like, okay, but where was Africa? It's interesting.
Just looking at the question about the map of grammar, I just found it in our book, and I tried to put the image in the chat and discovered that, at least from where I'm sitting, I can't put an image in the chat. But it is on page 132 and 133 of the book, and just I'm really being old-fashioned about this, but I'm going to just
hold it up and we'll see it.
Yeah, I'm going to hold it up. I mean, this is like where I am right now. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but this is what it looks like.
Whoa.
Can you see it? Yeah, it's kind of weird. So it is, it's from 1668, and it's by a guy named John Wilkins in a book called An Essay Toward a Real Character. And basically it's using it's using the image of a little man to illustrate prepositions. So some of them are before, some of them are behind. It's this really weird thing that just brings back slightly nightmarish memories of 7th grade with Mrs. Colley, who was a lovely teacher, but she had to teach us to diagram language. Do you remember diagramming sentences? Apparently they were also doing it in 1668. So that's in Dan Rosenberg's incredible essay in the book. And I will put the title in the chat.
That's exactly why I asked the question. Having suffered through diagramming sentences myself, I couldn't imagine how it could be as exciting as you were describing.
Yeah, I just, whenever I read Rosenberg's wonderful essay, I just think back to 7th grade. So let me go ahead and put the title and stuff in the chat.
You believe to know that in the early 2000s, when I got like one day of diagramming sentences.
Okay, that's good.
7th grade, and that was it.
If you had gone to parochial school, you would have done it for years and years and years.
My dad apparently is quite good at it. But...
Kären and Carolyn, this is Ken Habib. I want to ask you a question. Well, first off, I want to say that I got your book the other day, and it's a great book. And I would my next step would be to try to get you guys to sign it, if I could. But my question for today is, you mentioned that. Let's see if I can forget that. Oh, good grief. I'll come back to it. I'll have to come back. I'm sorry, I forgot it now. It had something to do with the Japanese maps, I believe. So, but I'll get it. And someone else can step in for a second.
Kären, were the Japanese maps largely woodblock prints?
Yes.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
Until the mid 19th century, at which point some people started doing copper plates, but the ones for public common consumption were almost always.
There were some beautiful maps at the Metropolitan Museum had an exhibition about 2 years ago, and they had a lot of these sort of woodblock maps or maps on silk, and they had the example of the Perry map, Yokohama, and a number of this like the prefectures with really, really detailed drawings, sort of the Japanese version of our sort of the sandboard maps you find in America, the fire maps. They're really beautiful.
It helped that there were some of the largest cities in the world, high rates of literacy, and peace for 250 years. Unlike what's going on in the United States and Europe at that point, the Japanese were able to actually generate a little bit of a cultural surplus, and what they did with it continues to be pretty marvelous.
Right.
Another point that I develop in my essay for the book is that these event maps had a really important role in a culture where commoners, that is to say non-samurai, were not supposed to talk about current events. So the only way that you could actually legally sell anything related to the news was to sell something like a map. Rumors were going around. Maybe you could have a little bit of a hint of a narration, but maps themselves became some of the most important ways that people circulated information about the site, at least, in which current events were unfolding.
You know, and another follow-up question on the Aztec pilgrimage map, where you show the duration of the stay at the various stops as little dots. Is there a totally elapsed time of that journey that you can derive from that, or is it really is it discontinuous in terms of its?
Yeah, it's the discontinuous time of mythology, right? Because Aslan, who knows where that was? There's like little circles that show you how many years they stayed in one spot, but the time in between is unclear.
Right.
So there's questions from Laura and Sean that I want to be sure to get to. So Laura's asking, what do you mean by deep time? That's me. So deep time is the coinage of John McPhee in 1981, the great Princeton essayist who's written so beautifully about the concept. Deep time is the idea that emerges in the 19th century that the earth is far older than the 6,000 years suggested by a literal reading of the Bible. And I care about this because I'm writing a book called How the New World Became Old, the Deep Time Revolution in America. That's when I finish it, Princeton University Press is going to publish it. But with the pandemic, tons of archives have been locked. So I'm sitting here in my house in Palo Alto going insane. Yeah, so it's all about how it becomes cognitively possible and desirable to imagine that the earth is not just hundreds or thousands of years old, but millions and even billions of years old. And it's a cool story that involves dinosaurs, such as the one you see behind me. So that's that question. We also had a question from Sean. Are any of the maps in the collection an example of anticipatory geography? I love that. Projecting a geographic vision onto a territory before that vision is actually realized. What a beautiful question. Well, Kären probably has her own answer to this, but I think that she showed you the example with Emma Willard's map of Indian migrations, right? Which has the Indians wrapped up in these migrating ovals, but already Emma Willard superimposes the lines of the future states of the United States, so as to show that, here comes the nation inexorably. It was always going to be here, and the Indians were just a chapter that is now past. So that's my answer. Kären, do you want to add to that?
Well, the largest category I'm aware of anticipatory mapping is maps made by and for architects and urban planners who are in the real estate business, in the development and speculation business. And the David Rumsey collection certainly does include some of those. In fact, there are maps of San Francisco that if you naively looked at them, you might not realize some of the buildings shown there were never built. Some of the streets shown there were never built, excavated. And in fact, one of the exercises I like to lead my own students through after giving them a timeline of San Francisco development is looking at maps that show the outline of the city of San Francisco being way out in what was then water. So anticipatory geography is a very common use of maps, right? Maps help people visualize and plan for completely new landscapes. And I've often wondered whether one of the reasons David Rumsey got interested in maps in the first place is because he worked in real estate. And I can't imagine an occupation, a profession where one is more reliant on maps than that.
I think Kate has a question on the slavery map.
I actually had two questions. One about the slavery map, the peak of slavery map. That was actually made by one of the authors. Where it was like showing when and where slavery peaked in different parts of the United States. And I guess my question is, so I'm actually in the middle of a 2-part survey course that's specifically African American history. And one of the things we discussed about was how slavery, even after it was banned in a state, it was only, especially in the northern states, it would be banned for a specific age group. And if you were outside that age group, you'd either remain a slave until you reached the age of maturity, whatever that was determined to be, or you would remain a slave for the rest of your life. And I was just wondering if that map incorporated that sort of quote unquote phasing out of slavery at all, or because it seemed to be fairly a little more concrete and said slavery ended here, and I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, right. So in many of the northern states, slavery was grandfathered out, but there were slaves in every state of the Union, even on the eve of the Civil War.
I think that's the original definition of grandfathering as well.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Something like that.
So yeah, Bill Rankin's map has to necessarily, in the interest of simplicity to kind of put hard lines onto the question, but he recognizes that there's a lot of fluidity in where slavery still is and isn't. And, in many places, it's really hard to tell the difference between who is enslaved and who is not. We tend to think of it as a binary. You either are or you aren't, but it is possible to be technically free, but to be deprived of so many civil rights, including the right to vote, including the right to move freely, including the right to hold a job, that the line between slave and free becomes muddied to the point of indistinguishability. But I think the key thing in that map that makes it such a good teaching tool is that it shows so dramatically to students that the population center of slavery shifts over time. And you'd be surprised at how hard that is to teach, but for some reason it is. And you had
I can imagine.
I wanted to add that I've put the address of and a link to William Rankin's website into the chat. If you haven't already checked out Radical Cartography, it's just www.radicalcartography.net.
Thank you. I will look at that.
It's intuitive for people younger than me to explore this website because the portals are like a video game. You just have to take your time to get in. What looks like just one little word over on the left-hand side kind of becomes the gateway into 100 maps sometimes. So there's a great deal of richness in there. It includes both some maps that he himself has made, quite a few, discussions of what he's doing and why his map design is unusual, but also he includes some of his favorite examples of mapping, including that Mississippi River one. So
I had a second question. And that was about the map collection that you derived these maps from. It was about the Stanford map collection. It reminded me, I was reminded when you were discussing this collection of how a lot of the really major American collections of Chinese art were formed, which was a lot of just smuggling and stuff. Or another example is there was a significant collection of Native American relics and garb and tool that was donated to Smithsonian, and because the donor, when he deeded it to them when he died, and because he didn't really record where it came from and stuff, they're still trying to figure out where the different stuff came from. And so I was just wondering how he put that together, that collection, if there's any discussion of that.
It's a very different story in the case of David Rumsey, who still is alive and still collecting, and who made a point of limiting himself to a segment of the historical map archive that others were not really collecting at the time he started, which I think was around the 1970s, which is to say printed maps.
Mhm.
So I bet he has records of all the purchases. He simply scoured curators and dealers' websites and began quietly buying up. To the point now, however, I understand when he starts developing an interest in an area, other people flock to it and start to collect behind him because they realize that he's so systematic and his sense of value is very good too. But yes,
that's reassuring.
the provenance is known and they're not usually terribly rare items. Many of them still survive in many, many copies, but he was interested in accumulating a big collection. There was one question in the chat for me. I think this is from Ken, who it's the delayed question maybe. Were Edo period maps made for certain segments of the society or were they more democratic? Great question. The ones that we've shown today were certainly made for everybody. They were sold in bookstalls in the big cities, and Edo was a city of 1 million, bigger than London for a long time. And there were lots of people who saw these, even if they couldn't buy them, but they say that a map was a surprisingly inexpensive object, about the price of a bowl of noodles, which just flabbergasts me. But they were very popular souvenirs for people for whom travel just meant walking, usually from city to city. These were lightweight, you could tuck them in a kimono sleeve, and they were perfect things to bring back as memoirs from a trip. So maps sold along with other kinds of prints, sumo wrestlers, courtesans, that kind of thing. They sold by the hundreds of thousands in total. There were underlying this kind of map, there were much rarer and more elaborately produced maps for the rulers of Japan. They're the ones who commissioned the surveys. They're the ones who pulled the information together that made a little map of the flooding of one river basin possible. And what's intriguing is that those maps made for the rulers were allowed to circulate among literate merchants who weren't themselves samurai, but had friends who were samurai. So maps were often lent out and copied. And these kind of salons of map lovers then somehow got connections to publishers. So a map that was originally made for the shogun could be copied, miniaturized, and then reproduced for very ordinary people to pick up for the price of a bowl of noodles. That's the story of Japanese cartography in a nutshell for the early modern period.
Wow. Oh, wow. Thank you.
Sure.
Looking here.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what your book entails and what it discusses. It sounds enormously complex and fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great observation from Kate, that today we've just given you a kind of flyover view on essays that are experts really diving into these specific modes. And it's interesting, we had to kind of cut off the book so that it wasn't 17 volumes long, because it's clear that not only could it expand in space, like we would have loved to have more on Africa. We have that one Egypt map, and it's 3,000 years of history, all on one page. But there's so much to say about African cartography. There's nothing on Australia or New Zealand, India, et cetera, et cetera. So there's room for another volume or two just on other places in the world. But also we had to chop it off at what is essentially the Renaissance. But can you imagine the neat stuff there is to say about all of the earlier time periods? So Kären and I try to manage our fatigue levels with all the scholarly projects that interest us. But if one day we have too little to do, we can expand on all of this.
How long did this project take you guys from start to finish?
Well, first we had to, it took about 9 months to plan and execute the conference, which was in November of 2017. And then it took about 2 years of all of the other stuff, is massaging each paper into something that looked like an essay that not only could stand alone, but that played well with others. And then, of course, the 1 year in production that everybody knows about. But again, I mean, I feel like probably half your speakers are from the University of Chicago Press, because they were just experts at doing this. They really know what they're doing in terms of publishing a visually lavish, but also scholarly contribution. So they were a joy to work with. But it was about 3 years, end to end.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. Any other questions? Well, not seeing any. I'd like to really, again, thank you guys so much for your presentation and your passion for maps in general and maps in time. So I think we've really enjoyed this conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you again and looking for future developments.
Privileged to be with you all. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining today. Stay safe and stay warm.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey, Roger, see you.
Hey, good to see you.
I'll look for that map. The harbor map looks interesting.
Yeah, it was shown, amazing. They, they wanted to develop more. It was, I think, 1920s.
Mhm.
And you could have still gotten ships up the river, but a lot of land available if you want to fill it in. Well, we have filled in. I mean,
Yeah.
Manhattan's tip is a lot larger than it was, but not in the scale that these guys were talking about.
Yeah, good. Well, good to
Okay,
meet you again. We'll look for you in the next meeting.
I hope so. Thank you very much for inviting me to this one.
Oh, you're anytime. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.